Afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing today, this afternoon? Hopefully this will be a nice break for some of you from watching the news all day. What we hope is that by the time we all check in, when this is over in an hour and a half, that we will actually have a little bit more information. Welcome everyone to rule number 8. I promised you last week that this was going to be a really good session. I think this is one of the most under-discussed, under-diagnosed, under-validated issues that happen to people after stroke. And this is post-stroke traumatic stress. And what we're going to talk about tonight is that this happens on a big old spectrum. So you might not have ever considered yourself to be living with PTSD before. It's something that is not often associated with medical issues in the clinical world and the way doctors talk about it. But what we know is that it's so much more than just something someone who's been to war might experience or somebody who's been assaulted might experience. It absolutely reaches anyone who's had a sudden and life-threatening experience happen to them. And there's some very specific things that can happen to people after stroke. And as always, why it really matters to us here at I Care for Your Brain is because it's a form of suffering that we want to alleviate, and it's a barrier to your optimal care. So I made sure to make it a priority in the stroke recovery guide and in our group because it really deserves a whole session in and of itself. We've talked a little bit in the past about post-stroke depression and different types of emotional reactions, but tonight we're really going to be focusing in on that post-traumatic stress. So if you were with us for session 7, I hope that you grew in your understanding about how your stroke really didn't just happen to you. It happens in its own unique way to the people who love and care about you, all the way from your spouse to a child to a friend to long-term doctors that you've had. So rule 7 was support those who support you. And the key points I wanted you to take away from that session were that caregivers often take on their new role with little or no preparation. 98% of caregivers, which is basically every caregiver, report one or more stressful problems in their everyday experience, but also a greater appreciation for life and often consider their care to be a labor of love. Your caregivers wouldn't be there if they really didn't love you. And I think that that's one of the best parts of doing my job is that I get to see love in action. Often it's really where the rubber hits the road. The nitty gritty of loving someone can really come out in caregiving. The higher your distress as a stroke survivor, the higher the distress of your caregiver is going to be. And that's true, especially the closer the relationship. And sometimes that can be used as motivation for you to work on some of your own issues, some things that maybe haven't gotten addressed prior to our group here, the more mental health sides of stroke, because sometimes it's hard for us to want to do things for ourselves. But when you say, well, this is really affecting your wife or this is really affecting your sister, sometimes that can give us the extra boost that we need. We talked about that there are relationship challenges after a stroke and that these are common, often do not get expressed within typical rehabilitation settings. I cannot tell you one program I've ever been a part of or have heard of in any of my training that took people in relationship and worked through stroke recovery together. So there's plenty of great programs for people, stroke survivors, and there are less, but still some good programs out there for caregivers and loved ones, but we very rarely bring those two groups together and put the relationship in the middle of the therapy conversation. And we concluded by talking about showing appreciation to your caregivers often. We discussed the 3 most common challenges for caregivers, and that those were managing uncertainty, just like you. Within a moment's notice, their life got flipped around. The more severe the stroke, the more the uncertainty is ginormous. And the idea is, what does the future hold? Number 2 is managing big anxious emotions. Caregivers oftentimes just click into gear and their focus is you and your safety and your health and your long-term prognosis. And when you stuff things down long enough, they tend to pop up in other places, and they can be very big and overwhelming. This is really what panic attacks are, is that we get so kind of tight inside that we almost like implode. And the third one was feeling overwhelmed by a new life and a new role. We talked about this many times. You go from wife to caregiver, from husband to caregiver. You have one way of relating to your person, and then all of a sudden you're in a totally different relationship dynamic with them. And one thing that really was clear to me from looking at this research is a big part of the problem is how little we prepare caregivers, how little we prepare them psychologically, and how little we prepare them with practical problem-solving activities of being a caregiver. We discussed the power of words, touch, and deed for communicating your appreciation. Very often, if you ask caregivers what they don't want the new car, they don't want a cruise, they just want to know that they are appreciated. And certainly that's something that we can all do better on. And we concluded with kind of a statement of advocacy, talking about how we need to do better for our caregivers, that we need to design these interventions that are part of post-stroke care, not just if you have access to the very best rehab in the world, but the fabric of post-stroke care needs to be more interpersonal and more relationship oriented. And we need to do this to improve caregiver and survivor quality of life and well-being. And I feel very strongly that it needs to kind of hit both poles, right? So the very highest level of the psychological impact, but also I'm such a believer in practical interventions. You have to literally give people skills on what they're supposed to do day in and day out. How can they set a routine? What do they need to be mindful of? You know, secondary stroke prevention. There's so many different things that we just don't talk about enough with our caregivers. So now we're going to move into rule number 8. And it's really hard to believe that we have been here for 8 sessions. And what it looks like to me when I look at the numbers of doing this group, I think I've had a core group of you guys from the very beginning, and mostly everyone who's here today has been here since rule 1. And that's really, really satisfying. I'm really, really grateful for that. Rule number 8 is acknowledge your trauma. If we do not acknowledge traumatic stress symptoms, we are missing an opportunity to optimize your recovery. And I want to tell you, as we get into this rule, how this came on my radar screen. So once I graduated from my postdoc up in Boston, I was recruited down to a faculty position at UNC Chapel Hill. That's how I got here to North Carolina. And I worked in physical medicine and rehabilitation. And one of my jobs was I was a part of the inpatient acute rehab team. And I had done a little rehab as a trainee, but this was the first time I was independently on my own working on that kind of a unit. And it was an excellent experience for many different reasons, but probably the most long-lasting thing that I walked away from is how much psychological need there is in rehab, and how we are so focused on most everything else besides the psychology, and how psychologists are so needed. I did much less assessment and kind of all the normal things I do as a neuropsychologist. I did much less of on that unit. It was really more about helping people understand what had happened and managing people's pretty significant anxiety. And a lot of that has to do with this topic. And right as I was about to leave UNC to transition into private practice, I wrote a grant application about stroke and PTSD. And so I had a chance to do a lot of research. And what was really important was that the field was finally accepting that people who were given highly stressful medical diagnoses were also kind of eligible to have PTSD. We really, I mean, you might even to this day in 2020 still think, I don't know, I can't have that. That's for soldiers, you know, that's for people who, you know, were mugged in New York City. Well, that's part of the learning tonight, is that absolutely not. And, you know, we don't have to be skimpy or competitive with mental health diagnoses. Just because someone else maybe had it worse than you doesn't mean that you don't have a right to put a label on what you've been experiencing. So let's get into it. A stroke is so much more than a physical brain trauma. And that's, as we come to, we have 2 more sessions after tonight. And as we kind of start to wrap our head around all the topics we've talked about together, there's a couple key learning points that really is in my heart that I really want you to walk away from this experience with. And this is one of them. A stroke is much more than a physical brain trauma. Even the definition of a stroke, right, is a cerebrovascular attack of a lack of blood and oxygen. And of course, that is what it is, but it really is for almost everyone a psychologically stressful event. And in that spectrum of stress, on the higher end, we have trauma. And so one of the things that, you're going to think about as we go through these slides tonight is where you fall in that spectrum. So after a stroke, there's a wide range of emotional reactions. Just as everyone in this world is different, so are our reactions to things. But the most common ones are shock. It can take a few days or longer to wrap your head around what has happened. Many people just feel afraid, right? It's something happened that could have killed me. I feel very vulnerable, especially if I don't understand why I had the stroke, or if my person, I didn't think this was going to happen to me. I'm 40 years old, or, I'm 70, but I'm super healthy. The more unexpected it was, the more you're going to feel vulnerable after. Self-blame, this is for some of our folks more so who were told perhaps that they had risk factors. You really need to get that diabetes under control or you could have a stroke. Stop smoking or you could have a stroke. So a lot of times what I saw in my unit was people really turning inward with blaming themselves and really feeling kind of regret. Another very common symptom is really immediately going into guilt mode, and more so putting your focus on your loved one. I don't want my wife to have to take care of me. And of course, this is all for the folks that are cognizant and aware and participating at the rehab level. I know some of you have had loved ones in whom the stroke was so severe that you didn't have any interaction with your person. And that's certainly at the high end of a traumatic experience, because talk about uncertainty, talk about what does the future hold? I mean, those are the most pressing questions. And for some, a stroke is experienced as something very scary, very disturbing, very, very difficult to see yourself having a disability, whereas you never have had any life experience with that before. And the folks we're really talking to tonight are the ones that continue to struggle with high anxiety. And again, this is something you hear me say over and over. Sometimes in stroke recovery, we can focus so much on the physical that we just don't slow down enough to take stock of the psychological impact. Now, it can be on us as people. We're busy doing other things. We're busy with recovery. But, I also hold the medical community to blame for this as well, because maybe you would have had more time to consider it if someone would have asked you questions in a standard follow-up appointment. If someone would have said, how much time do you spend thinking about having another stroke? How do you feel when you have to go back into a hospital? How much time do you spend avoiding thinking about your future? Okay, these are the telltale clinical signs of post-traumatic stress. And many providers don't really understand the rates of PTSD in the stroke community. And that's why, to me, the best I can do is bring you this information personally. So as part of your recovery and as part of your time here with me in this group, I want you to take some time and turn over what I call your stroke trauma rock. And why did I decide on this metaphor? Well, when things happen to us that are traumatic, what is very normal and what is human nature is that we want to bury it under a rock. We lived through it once. We don't want to think about it again. Well, it turns out that is really prolonging our suffering. Trauma, one of the truisms about trauma is trauma demands to be processed. You can put it off today, you can put it off next month, but at some point your trauma is going to manifest in you physically in things like stomach ache, headache, bad sleep, irritability, trouble eating too much, self-medicating in some form, or it's going to stifle you so much and you start to avoid more and more of life that you become your own person in your own island, and you then become more and more sensitive to stress. And it's a really, really vicious cycle. So as part of our time together tonight, what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to give you tools for figuring out, how do I really feel about this part of my recovery? So the big question here is, do I consider my stroke to be a psychologically traumatic event? And, even right now, as we go through, if you feel comfortable writing into that little Q&A bar, I would be curious to know how many of you do feel on some level that it was a traumatizing experience for you to live through, because no one really knows except you, right? So let's look at the definition of a traumatic event, because maybe you hadn't even considered my question before. So here is the definition of a traumatic event. It's any experience that involves the threat of death or serious injury, particularly when sudden or unexpected, and that results in intense feelings of fear and or helplessness. So for almost all strokes, there is the threat of serious injury, if not death. When a stroke happens, it's by its very nature, suddenly or out of the blue. And most people that I've ever spoken with, thousands of stroke survivors, when they can recall the immediate aftermath of the stroke, they will tell me that they felt very, very emotionally jarred, helpless, fearful, upset, confused, just a strong emotional reaction. So what I want to do right now is get a little bit more into the symptoms. And this is kind of for an average person, maybe going through a car accident, to a cancer diagnosis, to a stroke, to, getting a terrible phone call, someone that you love very much unexpectedly dies. And in the next slide, what we're going to do is map this on to stroke specifically. Okay, so let's start off a little bit kind of generic. So PTSD is really made up of 4 symptoms. And what we typically see is people have a little bit of symptoms in each category, but usually 1 or 2 are strongest. So the very first thing in PTSD is something called re-experiencing. And what this is reliving the event in your waking mind, in your nightmares, in your dreams, feeling as though the trauma is kind of happening again, and being unable to push it out of your mind. So sometimes we call these intrusive thoughts or intrusive images. And many people manage these with number 3. So if you're not relating to that one, it's not going to surprise me, because what you might be doing is a whole lot of avoidance, and I'll explain that relationship in a minute. Number 2 symptom of PTSD is what we call hyperarousal, always feeling like you're on alert, can't relax, can't let your guard down, kind of just a feeling of, somebody walks in the room and scares you a little bit and you kind of have like the big startle reaction. Really, really hard to just kind of put the worries of the world out of your mind and just sink into a state of safety and comfortability. Number 3 is the king, the queen of PTSD. This is how most people live with PTSD, is avoidance. They just start avoiding the things that make them anxious. I don't go here. I don't go to the mall. I don't go to hospitals. I don't do ambulances. So situations, people, thoughts, anything that really forces you to think about the trauma, people with traumatic stress can do a really, really good job of basically like out of sight, out of mind. If I don't think about it, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe it's not real. And number 4, and this is really a big focus later on in tonight's talk, is how the trauma affected the way you think about yourself, the world, or other people. And it turns out this is the root of PTSD. This is how it really hurts you. The other 3 symptoms make your life suffering. You suffer a lot with PTSD, but how it really has its dark, traumatic effect on you is how it changed the way, mostly how you think about yourself. So things like, I'm not worthy of love anymore. No one would want me. I'm not safe in my own body. No one can be trusted. I have no future. I'm going to die young. That's a very common thing in PTSD. People just feel this sense that their life is going to be cut short. So before we get to the next slide and we map this onto stroke, why does this matter? Why are we taking your precious time to talk about this? Well, we kind of said this too with caregivers last week. The thing that's really important to me is if we don't normalize these human experiences after stroke, people turn on themselves and they think, what the heck is wrong with me? I'm going crazy. I'm losing my mind. I'm going to lose it. But if you just understand that this is a common thing that happens to people, then you have a name for it and you can separate it from yourself a little bit. And it's no longer like, oh my God, Karen, what's wrong with you? You can't handle this. You're falling apart. It's like, oh, I lived through a stroke and I have this thing that is a real syndrome called PTSD and it has a name and here's what I'm going to do about it. Instead of it being so overwhelming, my hope for any of you who have this is that it starts to feel like a more manageable piece of your recovery. So now let's really bring this point home and see how you all relate to these different categories. So in the re-experiencing world, what could happen to you if you are experiencing post-stroke PTSD is any kind of nightmares about your stroke. Some people tell me they have nightmares about the way they were before when they could move all parts of their body. Some people tell me they have nightmares about the hospital. They have nightmares about the rehab. They have nightmares about another stroke, being shunned by people. Just anytime it shows up in your dreams and it's negative, we would consider that to be a re-experiencing symptom. This is another big one. Feeling that strong anxiety can be triggered by things like smells, objects, and any conversation that might remind you of a part of the stroke experience. Very, very common. People who are alert and conscious during the hospital stay have a strong aversion to going back into hospitals, and it's almost always a smell thing. I can relate to this only because I am not a fan of the dentist. I'm getting better at that as I get older, but many people have that feeling that when you walk into a dentist office, that smell that's in there, it just brings me immediate dread and my heart starts pumping and I start to get a little bit anxious. So some of you, if you hear an ambulance go by, if for some people, the sound of like a ventilator can really bring them back. It's anything that kind of triggers strong feelings, thoughts. The next one for re-experiencing can be feeling like the stroke is happening again. And I have a lot of empathy for this symptom because it's so normal and it's really hard to break because it's very hardwired in our brain. So this would be like if right before your stroke, you had a bad headache, right? Now you might have had 500 bad headaches in your life before the stroke, but for a very long time, if not the rest of your life, you're never really going to just have a headache again, right? It would make total sense if every time you felt that pang in your temple, your brain started to give you danger signals that, oh my God, maybe this is another one. So people, when they have those types of high physical focus on the symptoms that they think might be leading to another stroke, they start to scan their body a lot over and over all day, almost like going through the motions of, my heart's starting to flutter. Oh God, I remember that happened, 20 minutes before I had the stroke. So people then constantly start scanning their heart. I've seen many people like put their hand right here to kind of make sure their heart isn't beating too fast. People do all sorts of things. And why it matters as a neuropsychologist is because that's a huge internal distraction. And that can be part of why people have memory problems, why people have concentration problems. If they're so focused on making sure they don't get triggered, they can't give their full attention to what's right in front of them. Let's go on to the next column here. This is hyperarousal, which you can also think of as kind of being keyed up, on edge. Again, kind of almost feeling like a sitting duck type thing, constantly scanning your body for the symptoms, easily started, kind of always just feeling on edge, like you could never really just sink into being comfortable and relaxing. Avoidance, avoiding things like hospitals, maybe not wanting to go back to doctors, trying really hard to not think about your stroke experience, pretending it didn't happen, not wanting to talk about it. You know, some of the first people many of us knew in our lives who had PTSD was military personnel. And, you know, many of us have an uncle who, you know, was in Vietnam, but never talks about it. That can happen in stroke too. It's just this feeling of, when I think about it, it makes me upset. I can get very anxious and I don't want to talk about it. So that's oftentimes like the tip of the iceberg with all kinds of PTSD. And so if you hear yourself say that, if you have a loved one who says that, you know, we've got something under the surface there that someone's protecting. And the last one are those negative feelings about yourself or the world. So we went through some of these before, feeling like nothing good can happen to you anymore, and really having a hard time imagining the new you in a more neutral or positive way ever since the stroke. So you guys look at this number here, 1 in 4 are considered to have PTSD, right? And so it's not unusual, it's not rare. That's, you know, 25% of folks, that's pretty significant. So if you interview stroke survivors within the first 3 days, 4 days of when they have a stroke, many survivors, if they are aware and conscious, will tell you that they experienced a sense of terror. Now, terror is a pretty strong word, and it might not be the word you would choose, but it does bear thinking about. If you can think back to some of those early days and you really try to identify the emotions that you were having, right? What were those emotions? During a hospitalization, a high number of stroke survivors report things like extreme anxiety, despair, and shock. And what blows me away is, let's just think about that hospitalization period, right? Not even rehab. Now we're in the hospital. Imagine that someone is there in bed and they have just had a stroke and they are feeling extreme anxiety, shock, and despair. I find the hospital system a bit insensitive in terms of what they're trying to throw at the person or even the family, quite frankly. And this is less blame and more commentary, because I appreciate that they're trying to stabilize you and there's things you can do. But it's just kind of a word of empathy for medical providers. I think we need to be extremely sensitive about the way we approach people in the hospitalization phase. Like this, I'm talking about like volume of voice, keeping the hospital ward quiet, approaching gently, trying to keep staff as routine as we can so there's not so many changing faces, you know, really figuring out how much information the person can handle at a given time. Because when we're extremely anxious about anything, we are, you know, almost not able to take in new information. That's just the way our brain works. So if you're very overwhelmed, it's going to be very hard to like make a plan about how you're going to go home. In the weeks, months, and years after a stroke, there can be really long-standing anxieties. Again, the top ones are having another stroke, the idea that maybe your life isn't going to be as long because of the stroke, and fear of losing control of our bodies or our futures. Really deep things related to themes of control, right? And the unexpected. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you start to look at people who have the 1 in 4 that have the PTSD after a stroke, the severity of the PTSD, what they just found, this literally was a journal article that came out just a few months ago. It's something called rumination. This is what keeps the PTSD really, really high. And this is repeatedly thinking about your stroke, the symptoms, the causes, the consequences. So one of the lessons of tonight is, what is that sweet spot? What is that balance between not overthinking it? Don't let it be your entire lens with which you see life, but you also can't stick your neck in the ground and never think about it. So there's kind of this psychological safe spot in the middle of those two things. Now, just to take a minute and talk about this slide a little bit, you know, one of the things that happens to people cognitively after a stroke is that many times, and we've talked about this, the gas and the brake, the gas pedal and the brake pedal in the brain get kind of fouled up a little bit. And some people lose their gas and they can be more flat, kind of not necessarily that motivated to do things, just kind of, you know. And then we also get people who lose their brake. And these are the people that can be disinhibited. They have no filter anymore. And perseveration, not being able to let something go, the broken record effect, can really be a cognitive symptom. So perseveration, you know, that's something, rumination, perseveration's basically the same thing. In our testing that we do as neuropsychologists, we can see that in our testing. Something simple like asking someone with a stroke to write one long continuous line on your paper of cursive M's and N's. So one long line, never pick up the pen from the page and do M, N, M, N. So you got to do a lot of brake and gas for that. And we look for repeats. We look for perseveration. And so when we see that, just even in a drawing, neuropsychology tells us that that probably happens to that person in everyday life too. And if there's anxiety or depression, or people get stuck on different topics, oftentimes this is an issue with the brake. So again, remember, I said this at the beginning, it's not like you either have stroke, PTSD, or you don't, right? You can have a smidge, you can have a whole lot. It exists on a spectrum, and it may be different from day to day, depending what is going on in your world. However, I will tell you this, whatever the amount of traumatic stress that you have, it is weighing down your brain recovery, and you don't need anything else besides the physiological damage that happened in your brain to weigh down this recovery. Okay, so that's a very healthy way to look at it. You know, is this a ball and chain that's on my leg that if I could work on breaking some of those chains and freeing myself from this suffering of this PTSD, you know, how much more able would I be to commit to my recovery? So traumatic stress symptoms that go untreated result in poorer outcomes. So less physical recovery, less return of independence, and reduced quality of life for you or your loved ones. So I wanted to share with you a little study here that came out about 2 years ago, and they asked people who had stroke with and without PTSD to rank the quality of their life from 0 to 100. So 0 is like worst life ever. 10 is great. I love my life. So people who had the PTSD on top of the stroke rated their overall quality of life as 30 points lower than those who did not have PTSD. 30 points is pretty darn significant. And here's why it matters cognitively. You can think of it like this. That little bandit there in that car is your PTSD. And when it is riding high, it is at the wheel and it will hijack you. You are the cute red car. When you have PTSD, there's a part of the subcortical part of your brain in the middle of your brain called the amygdala. This is one of the oldest parts of the brain. Sometimes they call this the reptilian brain because it's been around so long. And basically, it's the fear center of your brain. It's the fight or flight core. It is the minute there's a threat in the environment, man, imaging studies tell us the amygdala just starts firing, firing, firing. And when we talked about the impact of anxiety a couple sessions ago, one of the things that we talked about is when the fight or flight system kicks in, part of the reason our heart starts pounding is the blood that's running throughout our body immediately goes to our core, because if there's a threat and we have to hijack it out of there, or we have to put up our dukes and fight, we want to have as much blood available to our heart and to our thighs and to our arm muscles to fight. Okay, so this is part of why if you've ever had a panic attack, you might know that your fingers go numb. That's a very quick thing. It's one of the first symptoms that happens in a panic attack. And oh boy, there we go. The blood's starting to pump to the middle and the heart's going to go wild. The same thing happens in the brain. So the blood goes more quick to the core, to the amygdala, because it wants as much energy there as possible to make these super rapid decisions. So just like your fingers can start to tingle with high anxiety because the loss of blood, the same thing happens in the brain. So now what's at stake is the prefrontal lobes, which is where we make our decisions, our plans, our filter is there, right? The thing, our brakes, the thing that stops us. Now the prefrontal lobes are suppressed because they don't have enough energy. And basically we are running on pure impulse. This is why it's never a good idea to try to make decisions when you're highly anxious, because you've literally lost good access to the decision rational part of your brain, okay? So what the PTSD brain focuses on is pure survival. There's no room for thriving. There's no room for self-actualizing. There's no room for high-level rehab goals. When you have PTSD, what you care about at the core is life or death. It might not feel that way, but that's part of what your brain is preoccupied with if you are scanning your body often for another sign of a stroke, if you can't get images of the hospital out of your mind. If those symptoms are happening to you, your brain has like a spotlight on survival, and that's what is consuming your brain a lot of your waking hours, and maybe even more so in your deep sleep. So you're going to have less restorative sleep, less emotional processing, because remember, we've learned that deep sleep is basically free therapy, because we're going through the day's events and trying to integrate what happened today into our life story and how we think about the world. We become much less able to handle things when we have PTSD. This is a big part of irritability, feeling super stressed about little things, is we're already overwhelmed at our baseline. If you have a stress level that's up to here, all day long, people can bug you and it can go up to here. You know, the garbage men forget to take your garbage. All right, now I'm up to here. You know, then the cable goes out right when they're about to call, you know, Arizona. And, you know, my stress level goes up here. And then, you know, I get a notice from the doctor that a procedure wasn't covered. You know, now I'm up here. Well, what about if you start the day up here? Any little thing that happens to you throughout the day is going to be the final straw. And when people act like that and they're in that kind of a mode, they're hard to be around. It's hard to be around someone who's on a hair trigger all the time, right? And also, if you're that filled up with the past, it's very hard to be in the present, okay? So we know that PTSD results in less learning and less memory. So, you know, we don't come into a new stressor or a new trauma like a blank slate, right? We're complex people that have life history. So with PTSD, turns out your life history matters an awful lot. Trauma is cumulative. Your chances of being highly traumatized by a stroke depends on your life history and how many other traumatic events that you have been through. So what I want you to do is let's go through this list and just, you know, raise your hand whenever you hear one that pre-stroke you've already been through, okay? So any type of near-death experience for yourself or a loved one, the death of a loved one, the loss of a loved one, divorce, separation, painful end to a close relationship, another major injury, another major medical issue, a significant car accident, assault of any kind, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect. This is a very under identified cause of trauma, not having your basic needs met, right? So many of us see other people who have mega traumas that we undervalue the impact of neglect. So neglect comes in all shapes and sizes, from not having your basic needs met, like not enough food in the house, you know, someone not giving a crap how you did in school, right? You're kind of on your own, you know, to being put in a closet. You know, it all depends on your life experience. The worst thing you can do with trauma is compare your trauma to another person's trauma. Your life is your life. It's your life experience, right? It doesn't matter what's happened to other people. What matters is on some level, if you have felt unseen or disregarded. That is some of the worst thing that can happen to us as a person. If you've lived through a natural disaster, if you've had a major financial loss, if you've had to file bankruptcy, these things are legit, okay? They matter. You went into this stroke with these life issues. This is in some ways maybe my most valued slide in this whole 10 session series. When I found this research, I felt so happy because I felt like I might be able to use this to go talk to doctors and especially emergency room personnel about how their way of interacting with you has a lasting effect. Okay, so how you were treated by your medical providers really matters. And the earlier in your stroke journey, it turns out, the more impactful this is. So the perception of healthcare workers' compassion when you are in a life-threatening situation like a stroke is associated with the subsequent development of PTSD. And this really makes me think of our posterior people. So what do I mean by that? So posterior means back of the brain. And so many of us have internalized this idea of the FAST model, right? Face, arms, side of the body, and time, right? That we need to, and speech, sorry, not side of the body, speech. If you don't have a face that's uneven, if you can speak, if you, have those traditional stroke symptoms and you go into an emergency room, you're going to get taken in and taken serious and getting your rightful workup pretty quick. But when you have a posterior stroke, these are our people who have dizziness, vertigo, eye movements. And many times, I bet there's one of you in this group right now, if not more, who were dismissed, who were literally told, this is a migraine, go home. Did you have anything to drink today? Didn't even get a CT scan. I see many, many people in my practice who did not find out they had a stroke until a few days later. So it turns out this is not only problematic in terms of your brain and a delay in treatment and the possibility of maybe getting one of the clot busting drugs. This is incredibly psychologically invalidating. And I think it gets back to that very painful experience of being neglected. If you are in pain and people around you who are supposed to care about you, our parents, if they see someone else in the family abusing us, oftentimes it's not the abuser that actually hurt us. It's the parent who was an observer, who was a witness, who didn't stop it or didn't believe it. So we have ideas in our mind about the way the world works and the goodness of people. And most of us live our lives thinking that doctors and nurses are good people who want to help us. And of course, the overwhelming majority are. But if you are extremely vulnerable and you know that there's something really, really wrong with you and you are told by an ER doctor to go home, man, that is painful. So if you have a history of significant traumas, many of you raised your hands, the stroke can sometimes feel like it's the final straw of how much you can cope with. And it gets back to those negative cognitions about yourself and the world. So that is, like I said before, the worst part of a trauma is that there's just something about us as human beings where we take it on, and it's very hard for us to blame the rightful person, right? So, an abused child will tell us, well, I was too loud. I dropped my sneakers and that's why my, dad hit me. I didn't listen. I went in and I got a second cookie. So, that's why I got beat. Okay. So that's a victim mentality, right? And so oftentimes the more trauma we go through, we almost can start to feel like there's a target on our back. I cannot tell you how many people I have heard that from. A dark cloud carries around my head, follows around my head. And that's not true. Okay. And I'm going to explain in a minute why that's not true. But when you believe that about yourself, that is suffering. I mean, how do you have a healthy spiritual relationship with whatever you believe, God, Jesus, the universe, whatever, if you feel that you are marked that you are destined for horrible things to happen to you. That is an incredible burden psychologically to carry around with you. But what's so important about finding the right help for these symptoms is that a good psychologist, a good counselor, can help you understand that that's absolutely untrue. What it is that your antenna is broken because of PTSD and the avoidance. So the way we handle stressful things is we go into that super protective mode, and we feel like if we can just stay on top of things, if we can always watch our back, if we don't let people in, we're not going to get hurt again, right? Which is a illusion that we have more control than we actually have. And so over time, we basically withdraw from life. The more trauma you have, the more emotional numbness you could have. And so the more our antenna kind of goes down and we close up the antenna, we're just not picking up on things. We're very impaired with first impressions from people. When people give us some signs that they might not be good and they might mistreat us, people who have bad antennas, they don't pick up on it. It's almost like they need to be smacked in the face by someone being a bad person before they're like, oh my God, oh, okay. Well, really, if you didn't have trauma and you look back on it, you would say, well, you know, they typically don't call me back, or, you know, they did promise me that one time we were going to go, you know, shopping and they never called me, or, you know, they've called me names before. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it's not that you're marked, it's that you're living with trauma. Okay, very, very important point. So we have evidence-based treatments for PTSD. And what I mean by that is they've gone through the rigors of, you know, double-blind, placebo, clinical trials, and they've been around for decades. The one that I like the most is called cognitive processing therapy, and we're going to actually do a little bit of that in a few minutes together. But can you believe this? Even as of 2020, there's been no controlled clinical trials for stroke-related PTSD, and I was surprised by that. I was disappointed by that. If you can, this is long work. We're going to start it tonight and give you some skills to get the ball rolling. But this, if you listen to this talk tonight and you are like, holy crap, you know, this is me, this is my person, please find an expert in trauma or a neuropsychologist to get on the road of healing. You truly, truly deserve it. These services are covered by most insurance companies, and I'm not naive, right? I understand some of you don't have access to care. Sometimes there's costs. Sometimes, you know, it doesn't feel like this is the right time. And that's why I wanted to give you the following evidence-based recommendations to help you get started. But remember, this is oftentimes something we need a skilled partner for. If you could have healed this on your own, you would have. I believe in you. I don't believe that people want to suffer. I truly believe that people are doing their very best in any given moment with the coping skills they have learned to date. So one of the most helpful things I think I can tell you is to stop trying so hard to not think about what you've been through, okay? Avoiding your thoughts, your memories, your feelings about what has happened to you has a boomerang effect. You're lying to yourself if you think you're just going to push it away and not ever think about it. You're only prolonging your emotional work that has to be done in order to heal. So one of my favorite quotes about PTSD and trauma is that the only way out of it is right down the middle. It's right through it. And so many of us try many sneaky things to go this way, to go under, to jump over, to drink it away, to numb ourselves away, overeat ourselves away. It's just when you're ready and you feel strong enough and you have the right support person, you got to go right down the middle. And I'm going to prove that to you right now, okay? The more we try to think about something, the more we think about something, okay? So I need to take a good look at this little cutie pie. I always think elephants are adorable. And you know what really gets me about them for some reason is their toenails. Look at those toenails. They are so cute. I always want to paint them every time I see an elephant. So obviously this elephant is pink. You can see that if you're not colorblind. I probably should have made it red because I live with a colorblind person. My husband is very colorblind. And so he would look at this elephant and think it was gray. So I should have known better. But assuming none of you are colorblind, I want you to close your eyes. And for the next 10 seconds, you are absolutely not allowed to think about this elephant. You can think about anything else you want, but you are prohibited. I'm going to come over to your house and you're going to get arrested by the elephant police if you think about this elephant. Okay, so close your eyes. And for the next 10 seconds, no elephant. Okay, well, I can tell you something. I thought about that elephant at least 3 times. The more I tried to say no elephant, it just popped up right there in my face, okay? But remember I said before, what's our sweet spot? Not avoiding your thoughts, your memories, your feelings about your stroke doesn't also mean open up the floodgates. Let's go right back into the darkest, most painful memories. No, 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 no. This is trauma work. Trauma work needs to be gradual. It needs to be safe. It needs to be paced. And the way we start in therapy is with this words of wisdom right here. Validating your own trauma. It's one of the things I've been trying to tell you in our last 50 minutes together. No one else knows your life story through and through. No one else knows what you have been through. If when I went through my check marks and you raised your hand and you said, wow, I have been through that. And wow, now I've got this stroke here. Okay. Be honest with yourself. Was it traumatic? Okay. You don't need anyone else to tell you that it was unexpected, that I felt helpless, that I thought maybe my life could be over. And that's symbolic. It doesn't mean literally my life's going to be over. You can feel like, if someone left you, your life would be over. If you weren't able to work anymore and you weren't going to be able to make a decent income, your life would be over. Okay. Anytime it's kind of like a life-threatening situation, that's trauma. So the first thing you have to do is accept that you've been through it. Okay. We don't want to compare ourselves to other people who've had it worse. I can't tell. That is a rampant issue in the military community. So where I live and practice in North Carolina, we have the world's, definitely America's largest group of special forces are at Fort Bragg down the road. And many, many times soldiers who have really been through very, very horrific things in Iraq or Afghanistan will say to me, I cannot claim that PTSD because, my buddies lost both legs or they lost an eye or, they really, really saw it. There's something about us where it's like, we don't want to claim it. We don't want to validate it because, I think it's because being humble is such a virtue in American culture. So there's this feeling almost like I don't want to be boasting that I have trauma. And it's really quite the opposite. Okay. So you're the only boss who can make this decision if your trauma is real or not. And then once you work through that, the next thing is to just have some genuine compassion for yourself. Self-care is kind of a phrase we've been hearing a lot of in the last year or two. And I'm so grateful for that because so many people, especially if you are minded like a caregiver, man, you are very empathic and you are totally in touch with other people's pain and you hate to see people suffer. And, you're the first one there with the chocolate chip cookies, but guess what? You have got to give yourself some of that sugar. You really got to monitor your thoughts and your actions. And how do you treat yourself? Would you treat yourself this way if you were really treating your child or your mother or a best friend? So many times the answer would be no. So it's a simple slide, but it's a deep concept, right? Have some compassion for yourself. And then the third part is giving yourself credit for how far you've come. If you're listening to me today, you're a survivor, you're coping, right? People that couldn't hack it, couldn't do it, suffered so much, they're not here. I mean, that's the reason people commit suicide is because they can't do it. And so when you've been through a trauma and you're still here, that's really something to be really proud of. And I hope that didn't come out in any way, shape, or form as being judgmental about our fellow humans who have committed suicide, because I can't imagine the pain. It must obviously be intolerable. But the truth is if you're still here, then you've got to give yourself some credit. It's very easy in a recovery world to just constantly focus on what's next, or what can I do? How is this still, hurting me or holding me back? Give yourself some dang credit for what you have done emotionally and physically. Okay. And this is key. This is to have a positive expectation. Begin to believe, deepen your belief that you can put the pieces of yourself back together and emotionally heal yourself. The way I look at this, you guys, is so many of you, if you identify with high anxiety or PTSD and you've never been to a counselor, I honestly believe that a big part of your suffering is you just haven't been validated and you haven't been given the tools. And if you haven't been validated or given the tools, you're going to feel broken and you're going to feel lost. And help is really just on the other side of validating, starting the process of self-care and self-compassion, and then having a belief that you can get through this. Okay. Very simple words, much easier said than done, but please really take them to heart. Okay. So action steps, I try to be practical here. So it is important to reflect on how your stroke has impacted you. For some people, there's positive parts of it. For some people, there's negative. For most of us, there's a little bit of both. Like I said before, this can be done with a mental health professional, but also, a trusted loved one. Or for some of you who are really, feel like you're alone, or you just really don't have the money for that copay, there are a lot of tools to do it on your own. It's not advised, but obviously it can be done. Identifying your own thoughts and feelings, just getting clear about how you really feel. Like I said at the beginning, maybe no one's really asked you in a serious way, slow down here. How has this really affected you as a person? Not just your leg or your right frontal lobe, right? You as a human being, as a person. And sharing these reflections can be a great start for counseling. You can call your insurance company tomorrow and say, hey, is there someone in my area that takes my insurance? There's a resource called psychologytoday.com. You can put your area, and you're probably not going to find someone who's got post-stroke PTSD listed as a symptom. But to me, trauma is very universal, right? Of course, there's some specific details related to your stroke. And in that sense, a neuropsychologist would be a great match. The truth is, not a ton of us do therapy, but some certainly do. And you can always email me or Carrie with your zip code and your insurance if you have it. And I would be more than happy to try to find a trauma-focused counselor in your area. But also just finding someone who specializes in trauma, because car accident, brain tumor, stroke, loss of a child, it's all trauma. And in some ways it's very universal. Starting that process can be really, really helpful with the next few slides we're going to have. It can be a great way to get a therapy relationship going. I said this earlier, probably the deep down way that trauma hurts us is by those negative beliefs that we start to take on. And the danger is that we believe that they're true, when really the truth is that's your trauma at the wheel. That's your prefrontal lobes not working very good, right? And we call these stuck points. So negative beliefs in the area of safety, trust, power, esteem, and intimacy are the most common. And this was actually taken from a researcher at Boston University. She's actually at Duke right now, Patty Resick. She was at the Boston VA when I was there, and I was very happy to be able to do some research with her. She's kind of the most renowned PTSD trauma treatment person, and she created cognitive processing therapy. And even though it's not been adapted to stroke, I took the liberty in the next few slides of adapting what she's done to stroke because of that universal nature. Okay, so she adapted this work related to women who had been raped. And so the idea was, after a rape, how do you think about being safe in the world? How do you trust other people? How do you feel about your sense of power, right? What about your self-esteem, and what about your intimacy? And what her work taught us is that is the real tragedy of trauma. It's really not so much the details about what happened to us. So if we go back to the emergency room example, it's not that, Dr. Joe Smith was in the emergency room on August 1st, 2017, and I came into the emergency room with a cerebellar stroke, and Dr. Smith, accused me of being drunk and told me to go home. That's the surface level, right? The deep level is that I was vulnerable and I was suffering, and I needed a human being, especially a doctor who's supposed to care about me, to see my pain, to help me, and to keep me safe. And when that doesn't happen, boy, that really, really hurts us psychologically. When we just have this lifelong idea, a mother is there to protect, a doctor is there to serve, right? When those chains of human definition get broken, we suffer quite a lot. So this is a pretty deep exercise I'm about to ask you to do, and it's something that you can pick up once we part ways today. Part of your handout for this week is going to be a copy of, they're kind of like journal prompts, and you can do it on your own. We're going to go through them now, and at the end, I want to teach you some grounding techniques, because remember before I said with trauma, we don't want to fully, let the floodgates open, and we don't want you to stay clammed up. So how can we, get to the middle part? If you haven't thought about these things ever before, or maybe you just, haven't really thought about it, it can feel a little overwhelming. And so when it does, I want to teach you some things at the end to kind of bring yourself back to the here and now. Okay. So let's think about this. It's a pretty deep question, really. And the way you can think about this is, my stroke affected my ability to feel safe in my body in the following ways. And I think that there's a lot here. I really do. I think that this is a really, really therapeutic question to ask yourself. How has this stroke affected my ability to feel safe in my own body? How has this stroke affected my ability to trust myself, to trust others, or to trust my own decisions? It's a pretty deep one. How has this stroke affected my ability to handle the challenges of life? So how effective do I feel? How much do I feel that I'm in charge of my own life? How has this stroke affected my ability to feel confident? That's a really big one. And the last one is, how has this stroke affected my ability to feel close to myself and others? And the reason I was saying before about maybe feeling overwhelmed by these questions is because they really get at the heart of it. And so sometimes, like with a symptom of, scanning your body, kind of always sensing, does that headache mean I'm going to have another bleed? Or, oh my gosh, I have pins and needles in my arm when I wake up. Does that mean I've had another stroke? If we stay at that level of symptom interpretation, then it can just feel like, oh, I really don't want to have a stroke again, right? But really, if we go back a second here, really it gets back to this. The heart of it is that we don't feel safe in our own bodies anymore. And there's a lot of, I don't know, I can feel how much resonance that might have for someone, because we're kind of like tearing away the layers and kind of exposing like the root of the problem. So I think those are deep. If you feel overwhelmed at any point, as psychologists, we often teach our people to do techniques called grounding techniques. And so I wanted to teach some of you those as you start to think about this important part of your recovery. So I love this one. This is visualizing a dial on your emotions. So you check in with yourself and, oh my gosh, I'm super high stress right now. Literally seeing a dial in front of you that, goes from 0 to 10, and physically imagining yourself. This is where your visualizations come in, your mental imagery. Imagine yourself cranking it down. You can definitely feel yourself starting to come down a couple notches. Clenching your fists and taking all of the thoughts and the feelings and putting them right into those fists, squeezing them as hard as you can, and then releasing them out of your hands. Okay. So many times what I tell my patients is we've got to get what's in here out. It's toxic when it stays inside you. I literally think of it like, and I don't know, maybe this is gross, but I think of it like black mold, or I think of it like fungus. Like, trauma, when it stays inside you, festers and gets worse. Okay. We need it to come out in words. We need it to come out in energy like that with fists. We can have it come out in tears, but we just can't let it sit inside you. That's really where it's poison. Okay. You can do a lot of visualizations about your safe place. Some people have a safe place at the beach. Some people have a safe place in the mountains. I might have told you guys this last time or the time before, but my favorite image I ever heard from someone was they imagined themselves getting really small and kind of real safe. And then I imagine it like this. They kind of imagine themselves crawling up into God's hand that's very big and strong, and just laying right there and kind of having the fingers of God go around them and holding them really tight. I love that one. Distracting yourself, count backwards, look around the room, name everything you can see. Some people go through all their senses. What do I see? What do I smell? What do I hear? A lot of people want to be brought back to earth. So a lot of times with anxiety, I mean, gosh, we all know this so well, is it takes us outside ourselves, right? At its most extreme, it can result in something we call dissociation, where we can almost see ourselves like a third person, right? Like on top of the ceiling and looking down, or we just go somewhere else mentally. And so a big thing you can do is really bringing yourself back to the here and now. Sometimes if I get super anxious, I know myself well enough to know that I get really hot. And so like if I'm on a plane and I'm flying somewhere, you will never see me without a glass of ice. That's the first thing I do when I walk onto a plane, is find the stewardess and ask her, would you please be so nice as to bring me a cup full of ice? Because if I can just stay cold, just while it's taking off, I'm fine once I get in the air. But when it's taking off, I just really need to do something to ground myself, because I can get all out of it. I like this one too. Imagining any stressful memories you have. Imagine that they're like a movie that are playing, and you can walk out of that movie theater anytime you want. At any time, you can step outside and go into the sunlight, come back to the here and now. You can just decide that, you know what, I'm done with this movie. We're going to walk outside for now. I love this one too. This is imagining yourself as a big, strong tree, and that you have these deep, deep roots growing out of your feet that are connecting you very, very securely to the earth, kind of like a tether that can never be broken and will always keep you right here, right now. And so you can sit in a chair, put those feet right on the ground and push the feet into the ground. These are things that we do in therapy with people if they start to get a little reactive when we're going through some trauma. So that's a very short explanation of a long recovery journey. But how will you know if you're healing? Well, if you can go through those stroke reflection statements, which again, you're going to get in the handout later today or tomorrow when Carrie sends it to you, and you can answer those questions in a positive or even a neutral way, really, that's really the sign that you're not stuck in it anymore. Your stuck points are healed and the trauma has lost its power. Okay. So that's kind of the goal, is to go through those 5 impact statements and be able to just say, I do feel mostly safe in my body, and I do feel good about who I am as a person, and I feel like I'm confident and I make my own decisions. Okay. So when they're neutral, when they're negative, that's often a sign that we need to do more psychological work there. And when they're neutral or positive, it's a simple way of checking in with yourself to see where you're at. There is a whole field of psychology that's becoming more and more popular called post-traumatic growth. And I wanted to just give you one slide on this so you could know that people are studying this. And basically, what this field of psychology teaches us is that trauma can actually give us the opportunity to become a better version of ourselves, gives us the opportunity for a greater sense of meaningfulness, higher satisfaction in life, or maybe even feeling more fulfilled. And I know that that sounds kind of crazy when you are in the midst of recovery, when you're in the midst of trauma. And again, I refuse to be naive about these kind of things, and I would never want to sit here and tell you that this is totally accessible to everyone listening to me, because I don't know if that's true. But I think it's possible for some people, and I think that there's nothing that can really stop you from being one of these post-traumatic growth people if you really, really, really do the work of the trauma and the stress underneath it. So what would post-traumatic growth look like? I think that's so hard for us to wrap our head around. Like, how could life be better now that I don't have my person, or now that I'm paralyzed, or now that I can't speak the way that I used to speak? So I just wanted to give you some statements. And I guess the way I want you to think about these things is their aspirations, right? It's just something to just try to wrap your head around and just think, how can I bring any more of this into my thinking? Okay. Number one, I have changed my priorities about what is important in life. And you know what I loved before when you guys raised your hands? So how about this? If anybody is feeling these as I read them, and you feel like you can stand behind that and say that because of this stroke, I feel X, I'd love for you to raise your hand, because I'm very curious how you yourselves think about these things. So I've changed my priorities about what is important in life. Anybody feel like they can relate to that? Oh, nice. Ooh. This is cool. I should have been asking you guys to raise your hand this whole time. I love that. I more clearly, oh, nice, Lupe. And that's awesome. I more clearly see that I can count on people in times of trouble. Nice. Nice, Penelope. Nice. I have a patient of mine, Penelope, and his girlfriend is pregnant, and they are going to name their baby Penelope. And I just found that out yesterday. And I said to my person, I was like, that is a beautiful name. I love that name. The next one is, I am more willing to express my emotions. Jerry, I knew you were going to come up. That's so cool. Wow, that's great. I think that's very positive. I know better that I can handle difficulties. Yeah, Jerry, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Dick and Jane, right? It's like, if you can go through this, boy, you really can feel like you can handle quite a bit. I can better appreciate each day. Nice. Great. Hey, Charles. Awesome. I have a greater appreciation for the value of my own life. That's great. I have more compassion for others. Yeah. That's it, nice. I think that's such I was talking, who was it? I was talking to somebody yesterday and talking about some things we had both been through. And I was trying to find the right words to express that, the truth is the people who go through stuff really are more appreciative and tend to be more sensitive and compassionate because they've had misfortune and they know what it's like to suffer, right? And I think that's why so many of us kind of instinctually don't like people who have never worked hard for something, is because it kind of feels like, you're never going to get someone else's pain if you haven't been through it yourself. And I think what we really need more of in this world is more compassion and more love for one another. So I think that's a beautiful post-traumatic growth moment to feel like we could have more love and support and unexpected kindness in the world as a result of trauma. I think that that's a really beautiful thing. I discovered that I'm stronger than I thought I was. You all are really so strong. I'm always so blown away by how strong people are. I am better at accepting that I need other people. Yeah. We are fundamentally social. That is the bottom line, is the way our brains have evolved over time is 100% to excel at interpersonal skills. That is why we are alive. It is to know that we need each other. I have grown spiritually because of my trauma. I bet that that's quite a journey, though. It's not very individualistic, I would imagine. And thinking back on some of those stroke impact statements, I know that there's people out there who've survived a stroke that are very angry at God and the world, you know, kind of a why me type thing. And I don't judge that at all, but I think that must be very painful. I think that this issue of trauma after a stroke is one of the most critical issues that should push survivors to be in community with other survivors. So I think it's critical. And Jerry, this is why your show is so great, is to connect with other stroke survivors who understand the personal side of stroke. As much as I care about you, as much as your people care about you, I think the truth is, until you've lived through a stroke, it's not possible to fully understand what that human experience is like. Talking about the psychological challenges you faced with other people who've been there can be incredibly validating. It can help you to understand that your feelings are normal and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Other people have been here, right? This is something that should be shared to reduce stigma. It's something that should be shared because why suffer more, right? My belief is that an extra layer of disability in all brain health challenges is a lack of education and a lack of empowerment. And I think when you see other people who've walked in your same shoes and come out the other side and are okay and are surviving and maybe even thriving, I don't think there's anything as healing as that. So I want you to please try to either find an in-person stroke support group. There's a lot of forums on Facebook. There's forums within forums. There's the Young Stroke Survivors group. There's the vertebral cerebellar stroke group. Sometimes there's the aphasia group. You know, I just think it's so key to find your people, find your tribe and talk to them and share and give of yourself and tell them what's worked for you. So what is our self-empowerment statement for rule number 8? You guys ready to say it all together? I will work to process how my stroke has affected me psychologically, and I will seek the tools I need to heal. That's really what this recovery is all about. It's healing on every level, right? It's not just the physical, it's not just the brain, right? It's you, your spirit, your soul. So when we are together again for rule number 9, this is our advocacy rule. This is insisting on follow-up care. This is next Thursday at 4 o'clock. If you haven't signed up and registered, you can go on our website listed there. I will be getting sad that we're on number 9 and we only have one more to go after this one next time. So we have 2 left. It's really been our pleasure, me and Carrie, to be here with you on this journey. And it's on my mind about what's next and how can I support your community more. So why don't we do our Q&A? I'm actually really pleased that people have been chiming in on this one. I think it's one of those ones that's a delicate topic. It can be, you know, a little bit, let me get back here to Zoom. All right, the Q&A can be a little tough, you know, a little tough to talk about. Okay, Miss Penelope, whose name I like so much. 7 months later, not as overwhelming, but it gets kicked in. Therapy helps. I'm so proud of you for doing therapy, Penelope. That's so great. That's basically like taking a stand and saying like, I matter. This matters. You know, I want to choose not to suffer, right? So yeah, time does not heal all wounds, but it definitely can take the intensity, because it's that suddenness that's such a part of the PTSD. But you're right, it gets kicked in, right? That's a trigger. And so triggers aren't just there for, you know, people who have, you know, been physically abused. You will have triggers, in my opinion, if you've lived through a stroke. And again, it's the more unexpected your stroke was, the more you're going to be someone who gets triggered. I wonder if you would be comfortable, Penelope, sharing what kind of things make it kick in. Smells are the #1 most powerful trigger, and that's because all other senses, so, you know, vision, touch, hearing, taste, they all run through the cortex before they get to the thalamus. And the thalamus is what we call the relay station, where everything flows in and out of, right? It's kind of like the hub of the train tracks. Smell goes directly into the olfactory bulb. So it has no time, no ability to be processed. It's raw emotion. And it is so powerful. I mean, I have a very strong sense reaction. It's not a trauma memory, but it's the strongest thing I can relate to with like diesel fumes from a bus. The minute I smell that, I'm instantly transported to Spain. I know this is kind of crazy, but when I was 15, I went to Spain and went around on a bus tour and stuff. And for some reason, whenever I smell like a bus exhaust, I'm immediately back in Spain. And it's almost like a little disconcerting. I have to like pull myself out of that memory. It's not necessarily traumatic, but the smell, it's like an immediate connection. So I have that with the dentist a little bit, right, too. So I can totally appreciate that. Jerry, tell us the name of your show, my dear, because Heather's asking me, and I want to say Second Chance Strokes. I'm so sorry that I can never remember. Okay, and then nice Penelope is telling me, in particular, reading about other people's experience and my realization of how lucky I've been. I had a right-sided basal ganglia bleed in March. Thank you for telling me that, Penelope. That's kind of like one of those things about empathy where there's the difference between kind of like intellectual compassion, like, oh my gosh, that's so hard, I'm so sad for that person. And then there's the like, I can feel it too. And, you know, that's, people nowadays talk about being an empath, where you almost feel other people's pain. So maybe that's kind of how you're oriented in general. And of course, you know, the personal experience. So that's going to be something that definitely triggers you. And the realization of how lucky you've been. Yeah. It's just overwhelming, I think, is what it is. And again, I'm just convinced that we just don't validate this stuff in general. And remember, what we learned today is the more you push something down, the more, okay, Carrie, is that better? I can't multitask and read Carrie's text and answer questions at the same time. Okay, Mr. Jerry. Jerry's going to tell us the name of his show today. Okay, Jerry says, the stroke gave me my passion, which you are so passionate, Jerry. Jerry's really been able to come through on that final part of the recovery journey. Not to say you don't have any more work to do, Jerry, but, you know, has a show on Facebook, you know, over the last several years has helped really hundreds of stroke survivors. And he's telling me here he's got all the 4 symptoms of PTSD, and he's always worried that I'm going to let everybody down because of my stroke. Jerry, it's so hard to see ourselves as others see us, because, you know, anyone who knows you, Jerry, knows that you always rise to the occasion. I mean, Jerry's like, you know, maybe my biggest supporter, Jerry. You always, you know, write me after a session and let me know, you know, how much it helped you. And, you know, that's the kind of stuff that really makes my day. So it's okay to feel that way. Just think about it a little bit and just think, you know, is that true, or is that maybe my PTSD kind of telling me a little bit of a lie. How has it affected my sense of living up to other people's expectations or other people's responsibilities? And then Jerry's teasing me if I have any bugs today. Good Lord, no. What happened to us? We had I think it was a murder hornet. And then we had the praying mantis. Gosh, that was just crazy. I think it was because I had the door open before I would check in with all of you here, and the little sucker must have gotten in somewhere, but no, thank goodness. Okay, strive for greatness. Oh, you guys are all so great. Let's talk stroke Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. And I think maybe, Salud, you also have, I know someone on here has a stroke with their husband. So Mr. Jerry is Strive for Greatness. Let's talk stroke. Awesome, awesome Facebook series for sure. And Miss Michelle is telling me she had a ruptured brain aneurysm and stroke 3.5 years ago. I was a news reporter and an anchor. My speech is gone. Man, that is when the thing that's changed is the thing that was your identity before. That is one of the most difficult things, because that's how we typically identify ourselves as a person, right? I'm a eloquent speaker. I'm so good at it, I can do it professionally. So to have to struggle through that, Michelle, is quite the journey. I hope you have a really good, trusted care partner to help you with all of that. I want you guys to all know, by the time we end on our 10th session, I'm going to come up with a list of other resources for everyone. There's a really, really important special program here in North Carolina called TAP, Triangle Aphasia Project. And maybe, Carrie, if you don't mind, when you send everyone the handout, can you just add a link to TAP? They are an amazing resource. I know Jane and Dick, you guys are big fans over there at TAP. They may have some resources for therapy when you have aphasia, and maybe also, oh, that's what it is. Maybe also too, in the age of telehealth with question and answers, if you have expressive aphasia and you're able to type still, that might be a way that you could do some therapy work over. Yes, Salute. So your show with your husband, Tom, I knew that, was Monday through Friday at 9:30 Pacific time. Tom and Salude's Real Life Redo. Yay, I love that. That is so wonderful. Oh, Michelle, you're 25 years old. That's really tough, sweetheart. But, just remember that we are all here for you in this group. I hope you're a part of the I Care for Your Brain Facebook group. We have a private group on there for stroke. It's a warm, welcome place. We would be so happy to have you here. And Jerry wants to make sure you know too, he's really happy that you guys are here. All right, let me see, we'll do a couple last questions here. Jerry wants to know, is this another reason you should go to a neuropsychologist? Jerry, come on now. Yes. Like I said, a trauma-based therapist or a neuropsychologist. And let's forget about these stereotypes about therapy, right? It's self-care, it's love, it's love for your family. Anything that's going to make you better is going to make you easier to live with, is going to make you able to be more of your true self, to let your spirit shine through these stroke symptoms. And especially if you have health insurance and you're not in therapy after a stroke, please change that. I mean, really, it's just as important as your physical therapy. It's just not as validated, right? So don't let the man or the system keep you from the resources that you need. So Dick and Jane have to tell me, Dick doesn't remember the actual stroke or the 7 weeks after the event. Right. Remembers the rehab facility is a comfortable place to be. On the other hand, I became hypervigilant. Yep. Watching for signs of a second stroke when he finally got home a year ago. Jane, PTSD is just as real in the caregiver as it is for the person. We have somewhat of a time limit in the series, and so I can't go through every single thing, but oh my goodness, some of you who are caregivers might have listened to me tonight and say, hey, that's not him, that's me, right? I'm the one who can't stop looking. I'm the one who, it's almost like, reminds me of, having a baby and, you wake up to make sure they're breathing all the time. That is a post-traumatic stress symptom. And so, if that extends into other parts of your life and you find that, you're suffering because of that. If you don't want to leave him alone, or if you can't sleep a good night because you're too busy checking on the stroke, that's not you living your best life, and you deserve to live that best life. Okay, everyone. Well, I guess it's back to the news. Back to the news to watch about the election. I hope all of you have a wonderful night. No matter what happens in the election, we really have to remember that we really are the United States of America. I'm definitely not going to get political, but it's a very, very stressful time, I think, right now to be an American. And honestly, I'm finding it to be a little bit distressing that there's such a divide out there in the world. But what I do when I start to feel like that is I just make my world a little smaller and remember all of the goodness and the love and kindness that I try to spread in my world and that I receive from other people. So maybe try to do that for yourself. Thank you guys so much. And we'll be back again next week talking about how to insist on follow-up care. Bye, you guys. Take care.